Okay, so we can get started now. All right, so our panel is titled The World Commission on Dams, 20 Years On, Revisiting Dams, Decision-Making and Development. So as you all know, it's a pretty small session, so I guess we can keep things semi-informal, So it's been 20 years since the World Commission on Dams published a critical report, which was sort of aimed at improving the design, construction, and operation of dams, right? So we were sort of thinking here at Future Dams, like what has changed in the past 20 years. We've been exploring that here. Everyone here in the discussion panel, David's not here, I guess, Chris and Tom, they've worked a little bit on that as well. So we just wanted to bring in researchers who are working on this issue to see if we learned anything from the past, what's changed, since like the global dam building renaissance from like 2005 to 2020. And I'm excited because we've got an exciting panel today here, and I'm looking forward to all the presentations. The presenters, if you could introduce yourselves before the presentation, that'd be great. But I'll just start off with the discussants here. And if David manages to make it, then I'll let him introduce himself as well before we move on with the exciting presentations. My name is Roshan Adhikari. I was trained as a microeconomist, but I am what you might call an interdisciplinary researcher. But most of my work focuses on planning, governance of water infrastructure and its impact on livelihoods. So the last couple of years I've been looking at dams in West Africa and groundwater in South Asia. And I work with the Future Dams project here at the University of Manchester. A small plug for Future Dams. Future Dams is like a interdisciplinary collection of researchers. We're funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund. We're based here in University of Manchester, but like a lot of other UK universities are involved as well. www.futuredams.org is the website if you'd like to look at some of our findings. We're in our third or fourth year, I guess. So there's a little bit of findings there. I wanted to introduce David, who is, in addition to being the professor of development studies here and who's got decades of experience working on rural development and poverty, he's also the PI of Future Dams. But since he's not here, I'm going to move on to Chris and Tom. If you could give your brief introductions, we can move on to presentations after that.
Yeah, thank you, Roshan. Also, thank you for organizing this special session. So yeah, I'm a colleague of Roshan. I'm also a postdoc in that same Future Dams project, working in the Department of Geography at the University of Cambridge, where I've been for the past 2.5 years. So my own research has been much more on the history of the World Commission on Dams, so looking at the processes that led to the World Commission on Dams and then the 2 years that it was active. So I've been interviewing all the people who were part of that process, which has been quite an interesting experience, interviewing a lot of people over Skype and a few people also in person. And yeah, the conference organizers, they had some restrictions on how many people can present in a panel. So although I won't be presenting today, I will be presenting next week in a Future Dams webinar. So if anyone is interested to hear more about the historical research that I've been doing, could participate in that, and I'll be leaving the link in the chat.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. Thanks, Roshan. So I'm Tom Higginbottom. I'm also a postdoc here at Manchester working on the Future Dams project. So I'm originally something more of a physical geographer by background. And since working on Future Dams, I've been quite interested in looking at irrigation schemes and where they work, and I guess more prominently, where and why they don't work particularly well, which is a big theme of our work linking to dams. So I have done recently, if Chris is doing a Future Dams webinar in next week, I did one recently, which there is a video available for that from some of our recent work that I can share if anyone is interested in that. So I'm looking forward to these discussions today. I think we've got quite an interesting range of panels, and hopefully we can take this a bit more relaxed as well, as we're quite relaxed for time.
All right, cheers, you guys. I guess, yeah, we can move on to the presentations now. First off, we have Sarah, who is also here at Manchester. She's a PhD student, and she's been looking at lessons from irrigation scheme performance, or I guess you could call it underperformance in West Africa, and what she's learned from her meta-analysis. So it's over to you, Sarah, but before that, I'd say maybe let's keep it under 20 minutes, like I said in the email. If it goes maybe around 16, 17, I'm gonna politely interrupt and say you've got 3 minutes left to all the presenters. And what had happened in one of the conferences I was organizing last month was when we do questions after each presentation, the last presenter sort of is cheated on time. So if we could do all questions at the end, if everyone's happy with that, we can take that approach. Okay, all right. Sarah, please go ahead.
All right, thank you, Roshan. I'm gonna share my screen, one moment. Does that look good? Yeah, okay, great, thank you. All right, yeah, so my name is Sarah Redeker. I'm a PhD student at the University of Manchester with the Future Dams project as well, like Roshan and Tom and Chris. And I'm very pleased to present a study today that is based on ongoing work of my PhD dissertation. And the study is titled Synthesizing Evidence on Irrigation Scheme Performance in West Africa. And it's a systematic literature review of irrigation scheme performance assessments in the region. So when I started with my literature review on irrigation scheme development and performance, two things became very quickly obvious. And that is, for one, that agricultural intensification through irrigation development is really essential to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular SDG 1, eradicating poverty, and SDG 2, zero hunger. And second, that irrigation development in West Africa actually lags far behind estimated potential, despite of a lot of investments. It's, for example, estimated that only around 4% of total cultivated area is equipped for irrigation in the region. But that small percentage contributes to around 25% of total value of agricultural outputs across sub-Saharan Africa. Now, why are large parts of the region poor and food insecure if the expansion and intensification of irrigation, of irrigated agriculture has been a key priority of governments and donors for decades? And I found that the evidence and literature about low performance of irrigation development holistic systematic assessment approaches. Now, this is the gap in literature that the study aims to address, and the overarching question that I wanted to answer is why, despite several decades and multiple cycles of investments in irrigation development, does irrigation development seem to have failed to deliver promised outcomes? And as this is a very complex question, I broke it down into sub-questions that I looked at in more detail. That's first, how are irrigation schemes assessed? So basically, what are the key factors that determine if the scheme works or not? And second, have irrigation schemes achieved their intended goals and objectives according to those factors? And third, what are the common reasons cited for the underperformance of irrigation infrastructure projects? At last, what lessons can we actually learn from past assessments? How can that inform improved planning of future irrigation projects? And like I said in the beginning, I addressed this question using a systematic review approach. And here you can see the outline of different steps to create the sample for the analysis. And after filtering out, the final sample included a total of 46 studies, of which 20 are reports, 22 are peer-reviewed journal articles, and 3 are working papers, and 1 is actually a PhD dissertation. So for each of the 46 case studies, we extracted information about the specific schemes assessed in each of the studies. That gave us a sample of a total of 145 irrigation schemes. And among these schemes are pump systems, dam and reservoir-based system, and a mix of gravity and pump designs. In the second step, we collected information on how the schemes have been assessed, including the applied counterfactual comparison, publication format, and the year of publication. But we also explored the use of performance indicators that have been used to assess irrigation performance. And finally, we summarized the main findings of each assessment to evaluate whether the assessed irrigation schemes actually performed below expectations according to the selected performance metrics, and recorded the main reason cited for underperformance. Now I'm going to show you some of the results related to the sample, and this map shows the location of the irrigation scheme in the sample. And the schemes are distributed across 11 countries within West Africa, and the majority of SF schemes are concentrated along the Senegal River and the Upper Volta Basin, but there's also kind of concentration in north of Nigeria. And I think that reflects the significant historic and current focus of development of irrigation schemes in these parts of West Africa. Here, this graph shows the years in which the schemes in our sample have been constructed, split by project size. And the review really shows that the majority of medium and large-scale projects were developed in the 70s and 80s. I think this is a trend consistent with drivers of irrigation scheme development across sub-Saharan Africa more widely, and certainly related to the food crisis followed the droughts in the Sahel region, and the increased interest afterwards to invest in large-scale water infrastructure. And maybe in comparison, like in the recent years, it's mostly small irrigation projects that are constructed around the millennium and afterwards. And I think this is like reflecting on the general discourse in the literature that condemns more large-scale infrastructure projects. However, like in the last years, we definitely see a renewed interest in large-scale projects as well. Looking at how these schemes have been assessed, most irrigation assessments, actually 91% of our sample, evaluate irrigation schemes using of publication or form of assessment. So most assessments that use spatial performance comparisons, actually peer-reviewed journal articles, and they assess scheme performance at a specific point of time, and often focusing on comparisons of several schemes located geographically close to one another, whereas most like temporal comparisons are reports by project financiers, for example, the World Bank, that compare proposed and achieved outcomes of schemes. And why am I showing this? I think it's really important to keep in mind that each type of a counterfactual has its own limitations and the ability to provide robust and detailed insights about scheme performance. And spatial comparisons tend to focus on household level productivity within 2 or more irrigation schemes within close proximity. So they are, these assessments do not evaluate added benefits for irrigation compared to non-irrigation, but they compare the performance of one irrigation scheme to another irrigation scheme. And therefore, these assessments provide limited information about irrigation scheme as tools to achieve overarching scheme objective, such as alleviating poverty and reducing food insecurity in comparison to a baseline of non-irrigators. In comparison, the temporal counterfactuals rely on relating proposed and achieved targets of the same scheme. And the majority of these assessments are reports from implementing agents, often with a focus on the economic viability of irrigation schemes. So these project performance reports are usually conducted in a very short time span, around 2 years after completion, and the point at a point basically where schemes still benefit from initial investments and farmers still often receive subsidies. And this is just like even more concerning that many of these assessments already report a low performance or declining performance even in this early stages after project completion. Limited and provide quite little information about how performance evolve over time or to the extent to which benefits are maintained in line with estimated project design lifespans. So in the next step was is to look at not just the approach, but also the applied performance indicators. So basically what determines if a scheme is a success. And we found that performance indicators can be broadly clustered into 4 categories: economic measures, agronomic measures, hydrologic measures, and multiple indicator analysis. And what's interesting, if you put these indicators on the assessments on a timeline, we can really see a trend of how schemes are assessed and how that changed over time. So the focus really seems to shift from a pure or mostly purely economic focus that highlights scheme performance on more like a macro level towards more diverse and complex performance assessments that focus on several aspects of irrigation scheme performance, more on a household level. And what we also see is a drop of assessment numbers around the 90s, early 2000s. And I guess that's rightly reflective of the general discourse at the time and general reduction in research, also criticism on irrigation projects and the aftermath of the World Commission on dams. Right. So I'm now going a bit more into what this assessments actually said, whether schemes are underperforming or not. And the most stated objectives of irrigation schemes I summarized somewhere around like to increase crop or most of the aspects of their irrigation schemes that are assessed as underperforming on the performance metrics that was applied, but across all performance metrics. So regardless of performance indicator or type of counterfactual study. And the reported problems underlying underperformance of schemes are often diverse and related to regional, social, environmental, and technical contexts, but can broadly be clustered really around these 2 main achieve. And then second, the inability to maintain irrigation schemes and the infrastructure post-construction. And I want to go a bit more into detail here. So the overestimation of net benefits is mostly due to a severe underestimation of costs and very overly optimistic views about what can actually be achieved from an irrigation schemes. And while these are the main issues, there are other problems playing into that have been mentioned in a lot of these performance assessment, which are a non-functioning institutional frameworks and a lack of project supporting policies, which is particularly one of the main reasons why many of the schemes constructed in the 1970s actually failed to or like declined in performance drastically shortly after completion. Another issue is the inability of planners to develop schemes that are suitable for heterogeneous farmer groups. Now, estimates of productivity are usually made based on general information on the prevailing crops and based on surveys of a limited number of farmers or farming households during feasibility assessments, if there are feasibility assessments. And often this means that expected agricultural benefits are based on average values of outcome for very small samples, which is not necessarily a good reflection of true conditions. And last is that the number of assessments of sample also highlight that underperformance is due to a failure to fully account for farmer preferences and attitudes related to risk and how this influences production decisions and associated scheme benefits. To maintain irrigation schemes often starts from already the overestimation of net benefits. So there's already an overestimation of what schemes actually can perform, but then on top of that, this is like even further further aggravated by the fact that this performance can't be maintained over time. And one of the most common reasons for inadequate scheme maintenance cited is a failure to consider long-term maintenance responsibility during the scheme design and implementation process. Most schemes need long-term subsidized support, And the studies now sample really report low maintenance and reduced scheme performance when support of subsidies is reduced and farmers are left to farm on their own without adequate training or management or the adequate financial support to actually maintain these schemes. Then another thing that plays into it is the issue of rehabilitation, which is a frequent occurrence as it enables large investments without the risk of setting up new irrigation sites. But the problem is that a steady monetary flow to rehabilitate projects provides little incentive for upkeeping and maintaining irrigation schemes. And the last frequent reason for low performance is actually a poor coordination of institutions that then support the rural development decision making regarding schemes and their maintenance with and without rehabilitation. So coming to the interesting question. So the systematic review highlighted that irrigation development in West Africa has many shortcomings, despite being such an essential tool for development. And despite decades of irrigation development, neither food self-sufficiency nor poverty alleviation has been achieved in West Africa. So the interesting question, so what's the way forward from here, right? And we argue that there's an urgent need to rethink how irrigation projects are designed and implemented and evaluated if they are truly to deliver benefits for rural populations and countries within the region. So our key recommendations are first to, for long-term sustainability of schemes, requires designs matched to livelihood goals of smallholder farmers. So basically what that means in general, irrigation systems that are geared toward the production of low-value cereal crops for food security, they rarely fund themselves even based on over-optimistic assumptions about developed area or crop production. And I'm specifically thinking about rice schemes here. And in this context, we need to rethink how irrigation investments are designed and managed to avoid costly and low-performing irrigation infrastructure in the future. Promoting smallholder efforts to adopt private irrigation or incorporate commercial agriculture might be the right approach in another setting. And second, enhanced monitoring and evaluation procedures are required to support the next generation of scheme developments. So really, despite the abundance of irrigation schemes in West Africa, there's such a lack of available data to evaluate irrigation scheme performance, especially in relation to intended project objectives. And scheme performance documentations frequently really stop after project completion, with our analysis showing that there's little, if any, empirical evidence to enable systematic performance reviews of schemes over time. And this makes it extremely difficult to objectively and reliably assess performance of irrigation investments. So these findings really raise concerns about the likely viability and performance of planned irrigation investments in West Africa, which are increasingly back. And we therefore really need an integrated assessment approach to inform future irrigation development. Yeah. Thank you. That's it. If you have any questions, I'm looking forward to answering them.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. Really interesting. I'll come to the questions in the end, but you've submitted this paper, right? Because
yeah, it's submitted, but I don't know. Its status is still uncertain.
So you're waiting for peer reviews? Because as a PhD student, I always found that like announcing the status of the paper helped with the comments, like what to look at for and stuff, if people had any in the end.
Yeah. So if anyone has ideas for me how to improve it, I could. For sure. There's probably still potential to incorporate that.
Cheers. Now, thank you. Thank you so much. All right. So yeah, next up we have Linda Ettrick. She also shared the paper with us, and I think it's coming up in a book chapter, if I'm not mistaken. I did see that. So from Africa, we're moving all the way to Latin America, Ecuador, about the Coca-Cola's Sinclair Dam. So off to you, Linda.
Thank you. Right, I shall try sharing my.
Yeah, please. And before you start, I guess we're like a small enough group that like we don't have to wait for all questions. If there's any like burning clarification questions, if you see a PowerPoint slide and you're like, I really want to know this, then feel free to ask that as people are presenting. Just let you see the bigger questions at the end is what I was trying to say.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if this works. Can everybody hear me and see me? Yeah?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay. Okay. I will start. So this is more policy analysis. My main area is not dams. It is global governance of the environment, indigenous peoples and the rights of nature. So I take more of a post-development approach, a buen vivir approach. And I'm speaking from Hanuna, which is a Seneca word for Turtle Island, which is the United States of America. So I have to start by positioning myself as an unsettler. So my work is mainly on a range of indigenous peoples in the Ecuadorian Amazon, the Guarani, the Sariaco Quichua, the Sapara. But dams sort of loomed large in Ecuador, as it's said to be the country with the highest level of highest number of rivers per square kilometer of any country in the world. And as you know, they're building dams all over the entire Amazon basin. So soon all the rivers will be affected. So I've got some maps here just to show the position of the Coca-Codo Sinclair Dam, which is the headwaters of the Amazon. So it's on the Coca River, which flows into the Napo River, which flows into the Amazon in Peru. And subsequent, the Coca-Codo Sinclair Dam was finished in 2016. It was planned way back in the 1980s. It was finally, construction began in 2010. And last year, the San Rafael waterfall, which is 20 kilometers downstream, sort of collapsed. The river took a different route. And there's been erosion along the river and floods. The collapse of the San Rafael waterfall caused the rupture of 3 oil pipelines, which caused oil contamination of the Amazon, of which there's a great deal of in Ecuador, dating back to 1972 to 1992, and the Texaco Chevron litigation in New York, described as the oil spills were described as the Amazon Chernobyl. So moving on, I'm going to move on to summary of what I'm going to cover. So this is just one particular dam, but there are, I think, lessons to be drawn from dams all over the world in different continents. I mean, it's interesting to compare dams in Africa and in Latin America, and to compare the so-called resource curse in Africa and Latin America. So certainly Ecuador is dependent on its oil exports, but I certainly would contest the idea that being dependent on oil means authoritarian government, because it certainly hasn't done so in the case of Ecuador. So I'm just going to move on to a general position of the dams on the Amazon. There must be more than 158, but anyway, there's 351 dams proposed. And these are already being affected by climate change, which is beginning to dry up the rivers. So the power capacity of the hydroelectric plants is going to be severely reduced by less rainfall, by climate change, by less rainfall, but more dams are envisioned. So, for example, the Coca-Cola-Sinclair Dam has enormous problems, structural problems, sedimentation problems, but also less river flow for energy than was anticipated. So that's now halved. So it's 100 square meters of water per second rather than 220. And because of the erosion and the risk to the plant, I mean, they are anticipating closing the plant after only 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. Considering the amount of investment that went into it, $3 billion, it's amazing that a dam is not expected to last more than 6 or 7 years. But there are major works going on at the moment. But it's interesting that all of this was anticipated long ago. So the decision to construct the dam is extraordinary, I think, in the circumstances, because it's maybe 15, 20 kilometers from a live volcano that erupted 2002, 2007. Construction did not begin in 2007 because the volcano erupted, and it's on an earthquake, in an earthquake zone, and 6.9 on the Richter scale is a serious earthquake in 1987. So there was an environmental impact assessment in 1998, which ruled it out completely as being reckless to build a dam of that size in an earthquake-prone area and under a volcano. But it went ahead anyway, and it went away with rather substandard construction as well. So people died in the construction of it for various reasons, and they've had enormous structural problems with it. So it never did operate full capacity. It came on stream in 2016, was working at half capacity. So the sediment built up, and the lack of sediment created the hungry water syndrome, which meant that the banks of the river downstream eroded. There were floods. Local communities were affected, including indigenous communities. Villages had to be evacuated. They embarked on litigation, and there was the contamination from the rupture of the oil pipelines. And as I mentioned, the collapse of the waterfall, which was attributed to the dam. So they've been, since 2020, they've been trying to build dikes, and there's the latest report I have is from the 16th of June of this year. So they are embarking on works, but if the erosion backs up to the dam, then the dam will be threatened, and the dam will have to be abandoned altogether. Moving on to the next slide. So why was the dam built? And here my unit of analysis is not just the structure of the global economy, but individual people. So individuals as my unit of analysis. But for an overview, Ecuador is in a situation of debt dependency, as with many Latin American countries. They've defaulted on the debt. They defaulted when the oil price went down. They defaulted in 2008, I believe, willfully defaulted. So they were ostracized by the Western financial institutions. So they had to turn to China as a lender of last resort. So China takes the oil, 80% of their oil, so they're entirely dependent on the Chinese for investment, and they were under the Correa administration until 2017 entirely dependent. And this is in the context of the rights of nature and the rights of indigenous peoples in the new constitution of 2008. So they wanted to, in terms of climate justice, hydropower was seen as clean energy, so they have a very small carbon footprint as they rely on hydro energy, and they export the oil and the oil pollution from the burning of fossil fuels elsewhere. So this was a survival strategy for the government. So why build all these dams? Here we have a picture of the devastation of the headwaters of the Amazon caused by the dams. And similarly, oil drilling is taking place in protected areas in the Yasuni National Park, Chinese oil companies who are drilling for oil. And the roads cause their own problems in terms of deforestation and the fishbone effect. So these are pictures of the dam, which is massive. So just in terms of recording some of the consequences or the impact of the construction of dams, as with oil drilling, it's not just the dam itself, but the associated roads through protected areas of the Ecuadorian Amazon. So you can see here that they needed a right of way, they needed roads to service the transmission lines. The transmission line was poorly planned, without stakeholder participation, and routed through protected areas to minimize the need to pay out compensation to private landowners. So this is a country where the rights of nature are enshrined in the Constitution of 2008. So why are these dams still being built? They do need the electricity, but it doesn't seem to be a very efficient way of creating electricity, apart from the fact of the loss of the biodiversity. So it's interesting to see individual payments to individuals within government institutions, within Petroecuador, where particular government officials received large sums of money, which then was diverted into tax havens. For example, Mossack Fonseca, much of this was revealed in the Panama Papers. So information comes from, if one can trust it, from the Department of Justice in the United States, in New York, from the Panama Papers. It's possible that some of the prosecutions in Ecuador itself are politically motivated, but there is evidence globally from hacking and other sources that suggest that individuals received large sums of money for this project, as well as for many other projects, particularly hydroelectric projects elsewhere in the country. So most of the government officials who authorized the construction of the Coca-Codo Sinclair Dam had been imprisoned for bribery or had left the country by 2020. So Odebrecht, it's one of the biggest bribery cases in history, according to the Department of Justice in New York. They were very much involved in initial plans for construction of various dams in Ecuador, some of which were halted because of the Panama Papers. And because of so many Odebrecht officials, company directors, who turned state evidence. So they gave evidence of having an entire department of Odebrecht devoted to bribery, and they named people to whom they had paid bribes. So, I mean, you then have to decide who you're going to believe as well. So going back to the Coca-Codo Sinclair Dam, Alexei Mosquera was Minister of Electricity and Renewable Energy in 2007, was sentenced to 5 years in prison for receiving $1 million from Odebrecht for the Toachi Pilaton hydroelectric plant. So we can see that there are a great number of organizations involved, but the information came from Odebrecht directors, from the Internal Revenue Service of the US, the Deutsche Bank, and the Panama Papers. And a particular figure is Ricky Davalos, who is supposed to have received $4.1 million from Odebrecht into a Panamanian company. And he seems to be involved with many of the, or several of the dams in Ecuador, and was employed by Chinese water and electric company, if not by Sino Hydro, who built the dam. So he had a registered address in Xinjiang in China until a few years ago. He has now absconded to Belize, I believe. And I think what's interesting was the involvement not only of Chinese companies and the Chinese Water and Electric Corporation, but also the involvement of the Russian government. And I don't know what their particular interest was, but they were involved in the Toachi Pilaton Dam, and then they didn't fulfill their contract. They withdrew. The contract was awarded to Sino Hydro, I believe, it was awarded to the Chinese International Water and Electric Company, TWE, which then withdrew, and it reverted to another Russian company. And I think we're looking at spheres of influence here. I mean, I'm not quite sure of the motivations, but certainly the Russian government was involved. I mean, it's interesting that people do go to jail, and that companies are taken off projects. But I think what's also interesting in terms of payment to individuals, I mean, it's possible that President Rafael Correa did not receive any money personally, but certainly Alianza País, his political party, did receive money from all sorts of private organizations, including, or state organizations, including Sino Hydro. And I think the Chinese International Water and Electric Corporation. And I mean, it may not be illegal to fund political parties, but that is an incentive possibly for construction, for unwise or reckless construction companies, construction projects. And I think we can see that in major infrastructural projects, not just in Ecuador, but in other parts of the world, where there's a private interest, which possibly is at variance with national interest, as well as interests of local people, of environmental peoples, and the environment. So I think I've covered everything. I just wanted to say that if I've got time, is that I'm not attempting to demonize the Chinese government on the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. That Xi Jinping has made enormous efforts to reduce the construction of dams on the Yangtze, on the Mekong River. So there has been legislation that has come into force. For example, there was new legislation to prevent any more dam construction on the Mekong River in 2016, and there was a court case. There was a construction of the Wulongshan Dam that began in 2015, and the dam flooded 17 hectares of the last remaining tropical rainforest in China, which is home to rare species. And the Luosuo River was important to fish species that had already been affected by other dams. So 14 dams being built along the section of the Mekong River since 1995. Anyway, a local Chinese NGO brought a court case against the company which had persisted in constructing this hydropower plant beyond when Xi Jinping put in the restrictions, and they brought a court case, and they succeeded in their court case, which I think is really interesting. And the company had to pay equivalent of $2.6 million in fines and rehabilitate the area, which would be somewhat difficult. So I think the central government possibly passing the buck onto state governments, and then state governments in China passing the buck onto local governments. So I think it raises questions of participation and interest of particular communities, and it raises questions of democratic accountability. And certainly that's true of the indigenous people of Ecuador, some of whom are in favor of construction projects and road projects and oil drilling, because it brings in income and jobs and services, and schools, hospitals, and water supply. So I want to, I mean, there are interesting questions that arise from this in terms of the interests of the rights of nature, the interests of the cultures of indigenous peoples versus the interests of development and the wishes of the majority of the population. So I'm raising a few questions there. So I will end there. Thank you. Did everybody hear that?
Yeah, no, that was good. I'm sure there's gonna be a lot of questions, so I'm gonna leave that till the end, but really exciting stuff. I'm just gonna move on to Laura now. Yeah, the title presentation is large-scale hydroelectric dams inherently undemocratic? And although the abstract kind of gives away the answer to that question, I'll let her explain that in more detail. Off to you, Laura.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Give me a second. I share my screen, and I think that is going to be this one. Are you seeing my presentation? Awesome. So, hello, everyone. I am Laura Castro Diaz. I'm a PhD student at the Department of Community Sustainability in Michigan State University. And I am originally from Colombia, so that's my accent, if you can hear it there. The first author of this paper is Maria Alejandra Garcia, who is currently presenting her comprehensive exam. So she has a good reason to not be here today. This is a collaborative work that we have been doing with other colleagues, such as Sergio, who is also here, and Maria Claudia Lopez. So yes, in this paper, we are asking if are large-scale hydroelectric dams inherently undemocratic? This is a paper that is currently under revise and resubmit in the Global and Environmental Change Journal. In the Global South and emerging economies, the construction of hydroelectric dams has been booming for the past several years. Whether large-scale dams in the Global North have been ready to build since the 70s, hydroelectric dams have been seen as an appealing energy source for Global South countries to be energy independent and generate clean energy. However, as Linda just presented, hydroelectric dams generate some social, ecological, and economic impacts, specifically in rural communities where dams are built. One of the most recognized social impact of hydroelectric dams is the resettlement and displacement of human populations. So usually dams are built in these rural areas and these communities need to be displaced to an urban setting, usually without consultation and participation processes. There are some policies that in the case of resettlement projects aim to restore and mitigate the impacts of this resettlement process. However, authors have identified that these policies are ineffective and that there is a persistent deficiency in the process of participation of impacted communities in decision-making. This lack of participation has a negative impact on people's right to decide over a project that will affect their lives and also the lives of future generations. Something that happens in the Global South country is that countries tend to blame the victims. So these like people who were resettled for failures in the participation for failures in participation. But the degree of citizen participation in resettlement processes is influenced by many factors, such as political conditions. And these political conditions are often interrelated. Most of the research that described the political conditions and participation in the case of hydroelectric dams in the Global South and emerging economies are cases of studies, or they study two dams, and there is little comparative studies worldwide. So this hinders empirical generalization and theory building. So for filling this gap, our research presents a medium and comparative study to explore the pathways of political conditions explaining the deficiency of participation in dam resettlement programs. In this study, the outcome or the phenomenon that we are going to explain is the deficiency of citizen participation in resettlement policies. So we are based on the Arnstein ladder of participation that goes from no participation or manipulation of the general public to civil society engagement or civil society power of it. As participation of civil society is influenced by different political conditions, we are using different causal conditions of this analysis. So our causal conditions are the characteristics that are associated with the outcome. We have 3 political conditions, and the first one is the forms of public opposition. One of the aims of social movements is to influence policy, and sometimes they manage to do so. So we are differentiated between institutionalized forms of opposition. So those are the ones that are using formal institutions like legal complaints, and contentious forms of protest like boycotts. Here, what we are doing is that we are expecting that non-institutionalized procedures in combination with other conditions will be sufficient for the deficiency of citizen participation. The second causal condition that we are using is the national regime. As participation mechanisms are context specific, the regime under dams are built is critical for policy outcomes. So we are differentiating between dams that were built under autocracies and dams that were built under democracies. The third causal condition that we have is international pressures. So here we are saying that international pressure may influence the degree of participation in resettlement policies. And in the case of hydroelectric dams or dams in general, the leading international guidelines for decision-making process is the World Commission of Dams report. That, as we know, it was released in the 2000s, and it presents a set of practices of involving different stakeholders in the processes of decision-making. We know that this report has been controversial. It has been accepted in some countries, in others has not been accepted. However, this report has facilitated the awareness of social implications of dams. So we are expecting here that dams that were built before the publication of these guidelines had fewer incentives for incorporating the voices of affected people by resettlement processes. And the third causal condition that we have is a project condition, that is the installed capacity. So installed capacity reflects the positive benefits of hydroelectric dams. So it's like the potential economic and political impacts of hydroelectric dams. Here we are including we are saying that less large hydroelectric dams in combination with other conditions will be sufficient for having less deficiency of citizen participation. So in summary, in this slide, what we are doing is that our theoretical background is based on the fact that participation of civil society in resettlement policies is influenced by the interaction of some political conditions. So what we are doing is that we're understanding the relationship among those political conditions and how they are sufficient for explaining the deficiency of citizen participation. So as our methods for data collection, the main source of information in this study is a qualitative meta-analysis that we have been conducting in our research team. This meta-analysis has a data set of 87 large-scale hydroelectric dams in the global south and emerging economies from papers that were published between the 1980s until 2019. We also had some information about public opposition from the Global Atlas of Environmental Justice, which is like one of the largest data sets of environmental conflicts in the globe. And we also use the democracy index. So we got information about the national political regime of each country, but the year when the dam was constructed. So in our analysis, we have dams that were constructed under autocracies and democracies. And when we are talking about autocracies, were dams that were built under single party regimes, dictatorships, and military dictatorships. And for data analysis, we used fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis. Here we have like a list of the dams that we are including in this particular study. There are 23 large-scale hydroelectric dams. Those are located in 14 countries in the global south and emerging economies. And these dams were built between 1957 and 2011. We also need to note that all of the dams that are included in this study faced public opposition. We didn't find information about dams that did not face public opposition to include in this analysis. Here, I just want to show you how was the outcome or the operationalization of the outcome. That is the efficiency of citizen participation. So as you remember, I mentioned that we are basing this calibration on Arnst ladder that goes from manipulation to citizen control. However, we did not find any dam in our cases that included citizen control. So for us, fully participatory are those cases in which people had the opportunity to make a choice between different types of resettlement and to negotiate by that, but none of them had citizen control. So our results, we found two main big results. So the first one is in the context of autocracies, and the other one involves the cases of mega dams that have high economic and political interest, but are built under both autocratic and democratic regimes. So our first pathway, sufficient to explain the efficiency of participation, is this one that we have here. Our results indicate that dams built under autocratic regimes before the publication of the World Commission of Dams report have deficits of participation in the design and implementation of resettlement policies. In this pathway, persists like, regardless there was forms of public opposition against these projects, these dams were built. And here we can see that dams were built like in a historical moment. The dams that are in this pathway were built between 1950s and the 80s in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And during this period of time, the national rulers and military dictators possessed power over major agencies in their nations. And what happened is that when there were objections against the government projects, they were repressed with violence and strong penalties. And it was very common for these different countries to have a speech that suggested that displaced communities were a necessary sacrifice for the good of the nation. So here, for example, we have the first one that we have here, where dams built under the single party, the communist single party nations of China under Mao Zedong's government. We also have cases in Latin America where dams were built under military dictatorship. So we have, for example, the case of the Bayano Dam in Panama that was built under Torrijos dictatorship, and Sobradinho Dam that was built under Medici dictatorship. Sobradinho is this case that was that catastrophic that motivated some organizations such as the World Bank to implement the first international standards for resettlement. And we also have a case in Africa, that is the Aswan Dam, built also under an autocracy and presented the project as critical for the development of the country. In this pathway, we also include the Three Gorges Dam, like the largest dam in the world, that was built in '93. That was also built under a single party regime. This dam included more processes of participation, but it did not give people the option to make like decisions over build or not the dam or where to move or not. And our second pathway includes the cases of mega dams. So these dams that, despite the fact that they had public opposition, with institutionalized actions, there was a deficiency of citizen participation. These mega dams were built under autocracies and under democracies, but both of them had top-down policies of development. So both of them, in both cases, were then not like the rulers of the country or like the government who made the decision whether to build or not the dam, and they did not include the participation of local communities. In this case, we have three main examples. That is, we have Yacyretá, that was built in the border between Argentina and Paraguay under an autocracy government. In both countries were under autocracies. The second example that we have here is Belo Monte, built in Brazil under a democracy, and Sardar Sarovar in India, that was also constructed under democracy. So let me expand a little bit more about one of the cases, that is Belo Monte. Belo Monte is an interesting case because it was planned under the military dictatorship in the 70s of Medellin. At the time, indigenous tribes of the region protested against the construction of this dam. And they were also supported by international media and international famous people. So these indigenous tribes, they were able to suspend the construction of the process. However, more or less 3 decades after that happened, there were some blackouts in Brazil, and the democratic government of Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff, they decided to build the Belo Monte hydroelectric dam. That is, as I mentioned, the 3rd largest dam in the world, and that it did not include local participation of local people. Last but not least, it's important also to mention here that we have here 2 cases that were built before the World Commission of Dams guidelines for people. And we have Belo Monte that was constructed after the World Commission of Guidelines. But here we can say that in both cases, there was low public participation. So as concluding remarks, first we have that mega dams have high economic and political interest, which are often over the needs of local populations. So mega dams, despite have the awareness of the World Commission of Dams, have deficits in local participation. We found also that dams built under autocratic regimes before of the World Commission of Dams have deficits of participation in the design and implementation of resettlement processes and policies. Deficits in participatory resettlement schemes happen when in certain scenarios. So in the case of mega dams, so the largest dams that we have in our analysis, of high economic importance, and in countries with top-down approaches. Projects, despite they were built under democracies and autocratic regimes, they were surrounded by violence. And we want to finish by posing the idea whether large-scale hydroelectric dams are inherently undemocratic. And here are Maria Alejandra's, the first author, email, and my email in case that you want to contact her also. So thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. Cheers. Thanks so much, Laura. I was gonna ask a question about the buoy dam, but like, yeah, after last presenter, Sergio, I was going to talk about World Commission Dams 2.0 towards the bottom-up approach to hydropower governance, and yeah, excited to have you here because I remember reading your the community-based natural resource management stuff in grad school. I think it was Ecology and Society paper that I did read. So really excited to hear your work.
Thank you very much for organizing this very nice panel. I almost feel like going back to the future because I did work in my early PhD, well, for my PhD on irrigation systems. And it's been very nice to listen to Sarah's presentation and to see that there are some issues that I also read about back in the days. And yeah, it looks like the same problems keep showing up on and on. And I also did my master's thesis on dams because I'm from Spain, and Spain has been huge on dam building, at least until 20 years ago. And again, I always have this feeling of, but have we learned anything? Are we approaching these two topics from the right perspective? Because it looks like, yeah, the same problems keep occurring on and on. But let me quickly start sharing my screen because I'm sort of going back to the dance, and I'm gonna be presenting a sort of collage that I've been of ideas and contribution that I've been compiling over the last year or so in different time points. These are not my ideas, of course. These are the ideas and contributions of a relatively large group of experts on the topic of hydropower dams, including Christopher, but also many others. This has been work supported by the Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, the NSF. And we are, among other things, trying to build a narrative about the governance of large hydropower dam building in the global south, and more specifically about whether we need to do something about this new momentum and the extent to which the World Commission of Dams can be a point of reference for us. Let's see if I can make this up. Okay, so this is the outline for my presentation. I will start with a bit of overview of the World Commission of Dams, lights and shades. And then I will go through, I think it's around 7 points through which we try to depict what's the new scenario, what's the new context that in case we want to think about the governance of hydropower dams in the global south, we want to bear in mind, at least compared to the context under which the World Commission of Dams was designed. I will finish with a slide thinking, okay, what that World Commission of Dams 2.0 might care about, or what could be the shape of it. Let's see if this works. Okay, so lights and shades of the World Commission of Dams. Christopher and Bill do a very nice job in their 2019 paper, pointing out that there are good things that the World Commission of Dams did, and there is evidence around it. So there was a reduction in public funding, dam building slowed down for several decades, and there has been a huge raise in awareness worldwide. I mean, this is probably not only thanks to the World Commission of Dams, but it certainly helped. We also see a number of cases of success. By success, I mean countries really signing the World Commission of Dams declaration and trying to promote it, like Germany, trying to develop a national water governance dialogue, for example, in Ghana, or in the advent of building new dams in certain countries. We also see some dams being built in theory following the recommendations of the World Commission of Dams, like the Bui Dam in Ghana precisely. But we also see some shades that have to do with the fact that, as it's been mentioned today, the impacts of dams still remain, and the controversy about dam building is still there, and even more, there's controversy about whether the World Commission of Dams did anything worth it at all, as Christopher and Bill also mentioned in their 2019 or 20. Now I hesitate who will clarify for us. Also very important, a number of countries that now have a lot of potential or stakes at hydropower dam building, like Brazil, India, China, never signed the declaration. Neither the World Bank, even if the World Bank shares some of the core values of the report, As Goodland says, the motto of the World Bank is that you need to break some eggs to make an omelette, and that is partially at odds with the spirit of the World Commission Dams report. And also, although we've seen multi-stakeholder dialogues going on, as I mentioned before, and the adoption of some guidelines, apparently, as some authors have pointed out, these have been good at raising awareness, but not necessarily at convincing governments and the industry. So a question that arises is it time to try again and get the biggest dam buildings to buy into responsible behaviors? In that case, is the World Commission of Dams model the only way forward? That's sort of our research question. And to answer that question, we need to characterize the new scenario, because a lot of things seem to have changed over the last decades. One of them, I would say on the positive side, is that we see an increased sophistication of social environmental impact assessment. So we see more and more, at least publications that promote a basin-wide assessment of the impact of dams. Assessments that not only evaluate impacts within the jurisdiction of the dam, but also further upstream and downstream. And assessments that not only care about the direct impact, but also the indirect impacts, for example, via land use changes. And assessments that also take into account climate change scenarios. On the negative side is that we are still weak on the long-term impacts of dams and on evaluations of mitigation proposals, or mitigation policies that are put forward to ameliorate the impact. In this context, one question that arises is, do these social environmental impact assessments have the capacity to stop dams from being built, or they are just means to improve the dams in the margins, to make them good dams, if that makes sense at all, at least in the context of large dams. And something that, well, we tend to forget when we focus on environmental and social assessments is that it's that of corruption. No? It's been mentioned today too. What can they do against corruption or state-driven development? Those are limitations. So even if we get the science right, does that make a difference at all? Another aspect is the privatization of financing and internationalization too, but also the privatization of it. So we see increasingly a fragmented scenario where public funding is sharing the space with public-private partnerships and bilateral funding. And this shouldn't be bad by default, but this comes with issues of opacity in the contracts and traceability of decisions, and therefore accountability of dam building impacts. Also importantly, the traditional players, mostly governments, are left with their responsibilities to carry out the social environmental impact assessments, and are subsidiarily responsible for the impacts, which is not necessarily very fair. So questions that arise with regard to sort of vertex of the context is, should financial institutions be convinced that it's time to turn into other forms of renewables, or should future dam governance efforts instead aim for regulating the involvement of those private finance actors? Next, we have China. As it's been also mentioned today, China has become a hegemonic power in the dam building business or industry, and China has adopted a very corporate behavior in this role. And as one of the colleagues from our group has pointed in several publications, indeed, there are push and pull factors. It's not only that Chinese government is interested in getting out of its frontiers for political, economic, reputational, geopolitical reasons, but also the developing countries from Africa, from Southeast Asia, are also interested in having Chinese money, or better put, development in the form of large dams being built on their side. The Chinese way, this is how some authors call it, it consists mostly in providing the money, which they have, but also build the dams, and in some cases also operate them and use the energy and trade the energy. So it comes with some exploitation model. And well, some authors have also said that the problem of this is also the Chinese government hasn't been very keen so far to align with the corporate social responsibility standards. So in this context, one question that arises is, shall the Chinese case be understood as treated as a case of new colonialism that goes beyond dam building? And may reputational concerns of China be an opportunity for international steering? Another aspect is the energy transition discourse. That's totally new as compared to 20 or 30 years ago. The hydropower has been even coined as the transition power. However, well, hydropower, at least to compare now to solar and wind power, is not necessarily that clean. There are, although still scant, there are evaluations that show that, well, the costs and emissions per kilowatt hour are indeed considerable and should be taken into account. In this case, well, assuming that hydropower is not necessarily the most economical source of renewable energy, is it time to say enough to hydropower development? But also, even if hydropower is the way to transition, does it guarantee that those transitions are always just? And speaking about justice, another important, I don't know if it's different, but in quality, because the environmental justice movements have existed for very long, but it has changed in quantity. Yes, environmental justice movement has acquired a global scale. It's not all anymore the fight of local communities who were fighting for their livelihoods against, say, large hydropower dams, but a well-articulated movement, and very interestingly, a movement that not only reacts and protests against dams, but also proposes alternatives to those hydropower dams, alternatives that are perfectly viable both socially and economically. So a question that emerges is how to integrate this alternative thinking, justice inspired, into dam building policy if possible. And very much related, we see a burst of so-called community energy projects, both in the global north and parts of the global south. For example, a number of distributed solar energy in Africa, but also solar generation community projects in the global north, Europe, but also the US. And we may also put in this box also water municipalization projects that speak about a new wave of reimagining how to produce and manage natural resources and energy in particular in a more localized and keeping it much closer to community accountability. That said, we also need to look back and recognize that small is not always beautiful because corruption exists at all levels, and there are also issues of elite capture and so on and so forth. So that should be taken into account. So questions that emerges are global north experiences extrapolable to the global south? How about South-South dialogue in this regard? How about extrapolation of solar generation experiences to small hydropower generation in the global south? Which governance systems may work to govern all these community energy projects? Coming to an end, we also need to recognize the advent of small hydropower and also a parallel trend of the commissioning dams, which tend to be mostly small too. So the advent of small dams can be understood with regard to their complementarity to large hydropower dams to serve the demand of grid communities, particularly in remote areas, but it also needs to be understood as a strategy from countries to circumvent environmental impact assessments. Also importantly, there's emerging evidence about the accumulated effect of small hydropower dams at the basin level. There are also studies showing that the commissions are not always good, or they have also negative impacts. Better put, it's the commissioning a dam is not a straightforward process and requires a lot of attention to how it's done. And so in this context, some questions that emerge are small dams the way countries circumvent social environmental impact assessments? Do small dams require different governance provisions? These are some of the questions one could be addressing. Finally, we see the emergence of new governance paradigms. We've seen that for the last 25 years, around the idea of participation. Indeed, the World Commission of Dams sort of was inspired by that also. And we've read, probably all of us, about the water energy food nexus that puts hydropower generation in the context of water management and food production, and calls for more integrated analysis of social environmental impacts. And we also see paradigms like the energy democracy that also calls for more local accountability of these processes. We also know a lot about participatory governance or collaborative governance, so we could build on that. And I refer here both to the pros, but also the cons. There are authors who have been criticizing these approaches for actually being all talk and no action. So indeed, are very large scale participatory processes realistic? Should the new paradigms also focus on framing the problem beyond the food, water, energy security, meaning framing the problem in a way, for example, that more support to small communities, small energy community projects would be justified? And with this slide, I would like to finish. So as a reminder, it's been said already, but there's close to 4,000 dams that produce more than I think it's 1 million dams, either planned or under construction, primarily in developing countries. So this is the bottom line that should put us to think how to govern this process. We've learned from the World Commission of Dams. There are alternatives to the World Commission of Dams, like the Hydropower Sustainability Assessment Protocol developed by the International Hydropower Association, basically the association of hydropower builders. And it seems that it's gained some acceptance among governments. So should we look at this initiative too? Then there is a Chinese case. Should it be treated differently? If so, how? And the local communities, there is growing evidence that they are not victims anymore, but they can be agents of transformation. So how to govern those processes bottom up, those processes that inspire us about the possibility of alternatives to large hydropower generation. we have the science. The science is increasingly sophisticated, as I said, but it looks like it may not be enough. Should we instead, or complementarily, thinking of governance assessments that try to prevent corruption ex ante? Of course, that would require a lot of intrusion in the sovereignty of countries, and that may be problematic. And finally, although the title of this presentation was towards a bottom-up approach, we recognize that this is a multi-scale problem, so nor top-down government-led or private financing-led hydropower generation or small bottom-up community projects will probably solve the controversy of the debate. Rather, we may think more polycentrically about this problem and thinking about, well, how to organize and coordinate the different decision-making centers, whether public or private, that are at different scales, that are currently deciding about this dam. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks so much, Oscar. Yeah, so I'm just gonna open the room to questions, and yeah, like I said, it's a small, intimate group. So yeah, fire away. Go ahead, comments, questions, anything. Yeah.
You first.
Thank you. So yeah, I have first a question that is to Sarah. And first, like, super interesting the work that you're doing. So I am interested more like in the part of the methods. So if I would like to know if you could explain more, expand more, what did you decide to use Scopus as your data set, and what are those other data sets that you are using?
Yeah, thank you. So for Scopus, I basically used for different combinations of words such as like irrigation, performance assessment, and also partial word search. And then like from the studies that I found there, I also extended by looking at recently cited studies that come across from the sample. And with other databases, I mostly meant, for example, the World Bank database. I looked at and just like IMI, IFPRI, and what like performance reports they had for projects they supported, and that mostly ended up being World Bank and African Development Bank reports, and they are usually these reports that are constructed or performed like maximum like 2, 3, 4 years after project completion. So they're really basically to like see what the return on investments is. Does that answer it?
So can I ask, like, so it's just like, and why do you choose Scopus instead of, for example, choosing Google Scholar or Web of Science?
Oh, well, I guess it's because I find it quite comprehensive. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, there's no real other reason, honestly.
Should I go ahead? Actually have a couple of questions for Sarah and Linda. May I go ahead and ask them both, or?
Yeah, no, please go ahead. I think it's yeah, small enough room that everyone can just fire away. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Sarah, for your presentation. It was nice to see that there are people still trying to look at, I assume, government-led projects or top-down sort of promoted projects. Maybe you can clarify also this. And yeah, okay, so my question is, has there been any learning from the 60s now? And of course, and how, whether you might be interested on this, or you've discussed it in your paper, how to assess that with your data, because you have a very nice data set over time. So I was wondering whether you had explored those reasons of failure over time, so to see whether the assessments were pointing out to different aspects, and whether, I mean, I guess, yeah, well, there were repetitions, and because if there are repetitions and things keep being done the same way, it looks like there hasn't been a lot of learning, and therefore the question is, who is doing this? Are there different actors that are doing this, or they do not learn from each other, and so on? So that was my question for Sarah. Well, I also had a clarification question in terms of who's managing these irrigation systems once they are built. Yeah, and then for Linda, yeah, the Coca Dam project seems to, I mean, it echoes some of the stories that I've learned about from Spain, where you have this dam project being proposed and rejected, and then a few years later being proposed again, and hopefully being approved. And this one was approved, but maybe it shouldn't. So did you have the feeling that that was the case, that this project was already on the shelves of some engineers waiting for windows of opportunity to be proposed, because I understand it was rejected? So how that, well, you could tell us a bit more about that. Another question I had is, you mentioned that by the end of your presentation that the Chinese government seems to also care about its reputation towards vis-a-vis the environment. Do you think that could be a lever internationally to maybe facilitate that it comes to terms vis-a-vis some of the, World Development, World Commission of Dams recommendations, or any other international standards? Okay.
Cheers. Okay. Maybe Sarah, you can go first. Maybe Tom, if you have to add anything to Sarah's answer, because Tom just yeah, he's got a paper out. Sarah and I are both co-authors on that one as well. So if he's got anything to add, and then we can move on to Linda and the questions after that. So Sarah on.
Yeah. So thank you for the question. So for the first question, basically, have there been any learnings over the years, in the sense of, has something essentially changed in how irrigation schemes are constructed? I think I would say no, not really, unfortunately. And I think there's these things have been criticized, like you said, like for years now, for decades now. Like there's so many sources, but I think what really the problem is that a lot of it is very hard to compare, and a lot of it is single cases and anecdotal, and it is probably difficult to draw a clear line, especially because there is definitely a lack of assessments that have been continuously done for the same schemes. So what I do think there's definitely an increasing debate around whether government managed, centrally managed irrigation schemes are the best approach, or if there should be more support for farmer-led irrigation initiatives, and just the acknowledgement that these farmer-managed irrigation systems are actually really widespread and on the sub-Saharan African continent, and are really important and essential for farmer livelihoods. And I think this is something that's picking up more and more also in research, and being more and more acknowledged also in projects financed by larger donors. Yeah, and as also goes, I think, directly to the second question, like who's managing these systems. For the sample that I had, these 145 irrigation schemes, there was a bit of everything in it. So there are schemes that are centrally managed by agencies of the governments where in the countries where the schemes are established. There's some of the schemes are managed by farming communities themselves. Some of the schemes seem to have no proper management at all, to be honest. But yeah, I think what was quite sad, or like comparing these studies, is that actually it doesn't really seem to matter who's managing it. That they're all quite poorly performing in whatever relation they're measured in. Yeah, I don't know, Tom, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Sarah said there. So in terms of has there been any real learning, I think the answer has to be no. But what there is, I think, is a case of people change the justification for doing basically the same project. So in the 60s or whatever, the World Bank would say, oh, this is essential for development. Then by the 70s, it was, oh, this is essential for food security. And then it would have been drought resistance. And now it's sustainable agriculture for climate change or whatever. But it's the same process underneath. And the part of the process links to what you said about the role of management. And these schemes are very inherently top-down government, almost sort of Soviet style central planning sort of framework, and that hasn't changed at all. And that's one of the reasons why in Sarah's work and in my paper I've recently published, why we think they continue to underfail is because the reason why governments and the World Bank like these schemes is because they want to promote food security, which is a national aim, whereas the farmers that work on them just want to make money. But those two end goals don't really overlap very much because there's not very much money to be made from bulk production of rice or grain or whatever. And on your point about the role of management, like, yeah, we think, well, I think at least that schemes that are more heavily managed perform poorer. And Bill Adams had some work in Kenya on this in the early 90s. And there is some evidence from schemes, the big schemes, particularly in Gezira, and then the Office de Niger in Mali, where when they implemented somewhat liberalizing reforms that gave more control to farmers, they performed a lot better. This led to big improvements in the early noughties and in the 90s, respectively. But this then creates problems because there's now sort of an increasing acknowledgement that farmer-led irrigation is quite effective and can be quite good. But when you start acknowledging things, the governments like to start controlling it more, which then tends to perform worse. So there's a degree of work by Chris de Bont in Tanzania around Kilimanjaro that shows that once these farmer-led schemes become more effective and they start getting more government recognition, the government then wants to take more control over them, which is then not really a desirable outcome. So yeah, I personally don't think anything major has changed. I think you get a lot of different labels for the same processes, and yeah, this is it in a way it's sort of the nature of governments to want to control things as much as possible, even when they are not maybe particularly effective at doing that. And like you say, you know, these are not new observations. These were made in the World Commission on Dams. They were made in papers in the early 80s, and you know, a lot of them probably reflect work that Ted Schur and people did in the 60s or what have you. But I assume we can write, you know, plenty more ink on these in the coming years.
Linda had a couple of questions directed them, but yeah, just wanted to say, Chris, yeah, feel free to chime in whenever, yeah, you want to.
Sorry, am I going to answer the questions now? Yes. About the reasons for building the Coca-Cola Sinclair Dam. I mean, it could have been half the size. I mean, they could have actually built a smaller dam. And I think as Tom was saying, it's to do with what a government is, and you know, centralized government, developing government, developmentalism under the Correa government. And I think that's what governments have to do. I mean, their role is to modernize, not to de-develop. And I think mistakes were made all along the line. I mean, there are people who said, yes, they did need electricity, but this wasn't the way to go about it. So, I mean, it was mismanagement. And also thinking, I mean, imagining that a dam would last 100 years and then it lasts 6 years. I mean, I don't know how they how they managed it. I mean, it's quite incredible. I mean, without an earthquake and without volcano, I mean, there will be earthquakes, and I mean, it could be devastating, you know, if the dam bursts and you know, the next earthquake or when the volcano erupts. So I mean, it was a foolish decision. I think it was, I mean, what I'm interested in is projects that are in the balance, but they're tipped over the edge by personal financial incentives or incentives in funding political parties, because the Correa government and Alianza País, they were, you know, hanging on by a thread. You know, there's a lot of, I mean, the Conservatives have won the last election, but the country's divided 50-50. So, I mean, they need the funds to finance their electoral campaigns. So I think there's a distortion in decision making, so that, and a lack of good faith, I suppose, which brings me on to China. That, I mean, I think there is an element of greenwashing, very much. It's about the country's reputation, and the conference on biodiversity in Beijing, I think that was for this year. I'm not sure if it's being held up because of COVID, but I mean, the Chinese government want to see themselves as the world's leaders in protecting the world from climate change. So they see themselves very much as particularly in the Trump era, when the US was sort of derelict in terms of climate negotiations. The Chinese wanted to step in to lead, you know, the world struggle against climate change. So I mean, to that extent, they do need to greenwash, and it's good for them. I mean, most of their initiatives within China don't seem to apply to countries where they're investing. And I mean, I think they're being pushed quite hard, you know, with the Belt and Road Initiative, because it's so damaging to environmental interests globally. I think within China, there's a huge effort by the government to keep the Chinese state companies in check. I mean, I mean, it's a bit like Volkswagen. They do cook the books. The companies cook the books and try to deceive the Chinese regulatory authorities. So I suppose what I'm interested in is good faith. I mean, is there any good faith? You know, why did Volkswagen lack a good faith? And how much good faith is there with Xi Jinping and his initiatives, or even Chinese state initiatives in trying to hold back dams on the Yangtze and the Mekong River? And I think the environmental crisis is so severe in China that it's actually genuine, because the water table is diminishing, the aquifers are diminishing, because they're having to build these just vast pipes to pipe water from South India to I mean, South China to North China, where there's, you know, major drought. So I mean, I think some of it is not, I mean, is genuine. I don't think it's greenwashing, but I think governments see their role as, you know, they have to be seen to be doing something, and they want to develop, and they want to build dams, and they want to create electricity. And I mean, it's possible that in some cases, as with Texaco, that developing country governments are slightly misled in that, and they embark in these projects with a degree of naivety or you know, lack of rigor. I don't know. I mean, in terms of sort of believing perhaps in other people's environmental impact assessments, which perhaps they, you know, that those environmental impact assessments may have an agenda. Anyway, that's just a few thoughts.
And I guess we're already over time, but Chris, I'll let you talk. Yeah, or ask questions. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I had actually questions for everyone, but they are very short questions, which can be answered very quickly, I think.
Yeah, I've got a question for everyone too.
You too,
your questions for everyone. Sarah, do you have a specific question directed towards a?
Well, if we need to finish sooner, I will just ask maybe Lotte, since she hasn't received any questions. So you had a global look at dams in that study, and I was just curious whether you saw any regional differences between the continents. So on the research that I've been doing and discussing with Bill, he always has a very African perspective on dams, and I find what is true about Africa is not necessarily so true about Asia or South America. So I was wondering whether you found that there were any differences in the regions or continents in your global approach.
Well, thank you. This is a very nice question. In this specific study, we did not look at that. We were like trying just like to see like the relationships among everything. However, we are doing like the 87 dams and comparing, like try to see differences between Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We have more dams definitely in Asia, and that can skew a little bit our data set. And in Latin America, like what we are seeing so far is that they're currently in the dams that we are including more large scale dams in areas like the Amazon. And we are not seeing many differences so far. We need to explore more that. I think that that's the next step of this qualitative meta-analysis. I wish I could give you a better answer now, but that's the next paper or something.
Yeah, sounds good.
So for the future.
Sarah, did you have a question specifically for a speaker or?
Yeah, I also had a question for Laura. I was just wondering if you have you come across a particular case where you would say that's like a best case scenario where actually participation was done well and the voice of the people has been heard and actually led to a change?
Also, super nice question. Like in our data set, unfortunately, there is not a case in which citizens, like in those 23 dams, that citizens were able to have like the power over the decision and say like, we do not want the dam here, or we want to have our resettlement done in this and other processes. However, some authors sometimes they claim that the resettlement process were successful, and that word will be defined by different authors super differently. So, for example, in the Belo Monte Dam, there is an author, her last name is Randell, and she claimed that some communities, the first communities that were resettled after the Belo Monte hydroelectric dam was constructed, that was a successful case because they were resettled from rural to rural areas. So that's actually super different than the other cases that we have seen. But if you look other authors that have done research there, we have done research there. Those are communities located downstream from the dam that they did not have any voice over it. They have not been compensated. So we have not found a project that like a successful case, but some authors sometimes claim that depending on the community that they are studying. So we need to see like, not just like little studies in, so like the system that is surrounding it. Thanks.
Choose, I guess I've got one question for everyone who wants to answer it. A lot of the presentations, the broad topic was like sort of this technical expertise versus political incentives, and looming in the background was the World Bank, right? So what do you guys think is the World Bank's role, like moving on? Because even in Sergio's presentation, it's just like, do we need a WCOD 2.0, or should they be involved? Should they not be involved? So it's a pretty like broad, open-ended question for everyone, I guess. Yeah, whoever wants to answer it. Yeah.
I've got a quick thought, I guess, in there is that we like to talk about governments and the World Bank and so on, but I think the role of sort of the technical companies and the engineering companies gets a bit neglected in here, because I think they are a big part of why a lot of schemes, and I think about this from an irrigation perspective more so than a hydropower context, but I think it applies. But the sort of the over optimism involved in these plans is a big reason for why problems occur, because the over optimism is what leads things to go over budget and over time, and then ultimately for them to be disappointing in the context. So I think in much the same way that, you know, sort of after the financial crash, people maybe thought about credit reference agencies a bit more skeptically. We need to be a bit more skeptical of the role of how good engineers are at predicting how well their projects will work and how much they'll cost. And this is nothing unique to the dams or anything. I think this applies to all aspects of irrigation and infrastructure. So that would be my thoughts.
Yeah, I just wanted to, report on what's going on in Spain. It's, I guess, not a global south country, but there's still a very strong corps of engineers that dominate the river basin organizations, which are responsible for promoting dams, although they are not promoting dams anymore. But and the big change in the last couple of decades is that they started to outsource all that engineering work to consultancies. So it looks like, and at the same time hiring a more diversified expertise like management or, you know, ecologists and all that, but they still rely a lot on those outsourced engineers. Yeah, as it's been pointed out today, it looks like the problem are not necessarily dams. It could be anything else. The problem seems to be very much related to the governance structure and the alignment of interests behind it. Yeah, just to emphasize what's been said.
Maybe I can follow on that. So the question I would have wanted to ask you also, so proposing this World Commission on Dams 2.0, I mean, one of the main achievements or things that were special about it is that it involved all the stakeholder groups. So you had the business sector, you had government people, activists, researchers, and so on. So I was just wondering whether this idea for World Commission on Dams 2.0 came out of a similar previous experience where you have worked with business people and NGOs and everyone really, and had sort of had a joint vision towards something, or that might be a plan for the future also. I mean, of course, we can discuss that internally since we've discussed it in the past, but it would be an interesting question.
Very interesting question, Christopher. I would love to chat about this on an internal basis. Also, because I think it was you that mentioned, well, how about the hydropower assessment protocol, what is going on there? And that made me think, we need to think a bit more out of the box here, including these inclusive participatory processes that happen at once, like the World Commission. What if we think differently about it? Because inclusivity it's been raised as an issue. There are a lot of trade-offs when you try to be very inclusive. So I don't have an answer, but thanks for your question. It's food for thought.
Yeah, I mean, it was more of a comment rather than a specific question.
I've got a brief comment about the World Bank. I think looking at it over the years, I mean, it's so huge and contradictory, and one department does one thing and another department does another. The right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. And I think they do produce amazing reports that seem to disappear into a black hole and you never see them again. I mean, I think there is a problem of multiple accountability disorder. There's so many organizations and so many measures, and no one, I mean, there's a lot of people not knowing what other people are doing, especially in the UN. So I think there's a lack of coordination. There's too much siloization of different organizations. So I think that there needs to be much sort of rationalization and better coordination. And I think the World Bank tries to do everything at once and then fails. But I think the potential is there for them. I mean, I think they have to have a role. I mean, I don't think they're going to disappear overnight. So if they are going to have a role, then they also need to be accountable to themselves as much as anything else.
Yes, one thing I found interesting looking at irrigation schemes is the World Bank sort of appraisal report would very often say that the entire scheme was a terrible idea and it couldn't believe that anyone considered giving money to this obvious train wreck. And then 2 years later, an almost identical project was like 50 kilometers down the road. And then the appraisal report for that says, well, this was obviously a train wreck. And it's like, well, you probably share an office like, 3 corridors away from each other. Maybe you could, talk a bit here and some of these problems might fix themselves.
And I just want to add that related to that, we have seen in the case of hydroelectric dams, and sometimes the World Bank do not give the money specifically to build the dam, but the World Bank also give the money to the resettlement process. So it's that's part of the miscommunication that they also have. It's important to explore.
For sure. In interest of time, I think we were supposed to be done at 4:45. I don't know if Harriet's going to kick us out or not, but any final thoughts or questions is what I would like to offer everyone. Yes.
I actually have to leave right now. I have another commitment, but it's been a great pleasure to spend this time with you all, and I hope we can keep in touch due to our common interests. Have a very nice rest of the day and week. Bye-bye.
Here's okay. Yeah, I'm going to end this as well. I'm going to send an email to everyone because I'm writing a short blog post on all you guys' presentations. So yeah, that way everyone will have access to everyone's emails and everything. Yeah. Thank you all for coming, especially the PhD students. Yeah. Cheers. Sorry.
Right.
Thanks everyone.
Thank
Very interesting
you.
talks.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.